up? So that's 13th of Nissan 5786. Tuesday, March 1st, 2026. No one for sure elevate, divrei, Elohim, Chaim, but this is the Missouri we live by. "95 days of this bitch." "3760 creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, Chava, 3631, 137, son of Adam was born. Alright, here we go. This is so good. I might watch it again.
Welcome to Meta, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
We might watch it
One
again.
of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on these ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed and that we have it, or that Kabbalah is one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophet of Israel unto the rise of modern Hasidism. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to censure developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, the Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the for 3 academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy, by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate the consideration. Now, let's go to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Folks, so let's just review a bit Shabbatai and let's move past Shabbatai on this guy. As you can see, he's there on the left, and as I mentioned a minute ago, this is a depiction from what this is what he probably looked like. It's actually pretty difficult to underplay that was Shabbatinism. We're talking about a movement that basically began in 1666 and didn't end until 1880s, probably. We're talking about a movement, sort of vast or inside Judaism, that led people to believe that abandoning Judaism was part of their self. I can't really articulate how much of a disaster that is. When people believe that converting to a religion that hates them, that is actively seeking their conversion to destroy their identity, it's a disaster. It's really a disaster. Now, when an individual Jew decides to convert, when an individual Jew decides to leave Judaism for reasons of conscience, that's business, and that's their right. They should be allowed to convert to whatever religion they find they fit. But the truth of the matter is, these people converting because of a choice they were making They were converted because they're by people who delusionally believe in their messianic message. So in that way, I do see this as a kind of moving disaster train wreck stretched over 2 centuries. And Frankism was especially bad. We're talking about Jews had been systematically oppressed for centuries in Poland. They were brought by the thousands into Catholicism. And as you can imagine, the moment they converted into Catholicism, when they converting back was not an easy thing. We should not forget that converting back out of Islam is a death penalty. That's a process. That's a death penalty case. And of course, no one has to remind anyone about the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition. Converting to Catholicism and then trying to convert back is not going to happen. This is a one-way street. And Frankism and Shabbatianism were a disaster for thousands of Jews over the course of a couple of centuries. And I think these should be considered forced conversions of a certain time, because they were predicated on the idea of potential. Things are ultimately going to end really fast. And that never materialized. The end just got delayed. And secondly, these conversions from Judaism to Catholicism and Islam, the mystical jibber jabber that underwrote them constantly changed. It was never systematic. There was never any spelled out theory about why this worked. You have a bunch of charismatic men at the center of this movement who benefit from these conversions. Frank benefited from Shabbatai in his own way, also benefited. And this is a situation where I think people were led into conversions that were, I think, forced by the charismatic leaders of that movement. In the same way that I don't think that we let Jonestown kill themselves. I think they were murdered by Jim Jones. I refuse to characterize what happened in Jonestown as mass suicide. That was mass murder dictated by Jim Jones. And so I think that in many ways these conversions were forced. They were forced by the communist leaders. And to be clear, an argument can be made, the argument, that this is what happens when mysticism goes off the rails. This is what happens when rationalism is abandoned. This is what happens when you allow emotion and you allow fervor that you don't really understand to basically run ramshot. And at the end of the day, I'm very sympathetic to mysticism. I'm very sympathetic in many ways to Kabbalah. This is the gutter of Kabbalah. It has converted. And it's a disaster of the ship. Now, what's interesting about that is that given this disaster, given the extraordinarily disappointment of the Shabbatian movement, given the mass conversions that followed in the wake of Shabbatai and Frankism, kind of got off with a light touch. Kabbalah survived. I think that after all this, many people who had seen the danger of what Kabbalah could do, what Kabbalah could do unchecked, it's this whole Kabbalistic thing, this entire thing has led to conversion. We need to abandon this idea. This idea is toxic, it's dangerous. Well, they did realize it was dangerous. That's to be sure. We'll talk about that more tonight. They did realize it was dangerous, and they made safeguards. They put rails on the system to ensure that it did not go off the rails. Because again, Kabbalah, it really got off with a pretty much actually. And I think that part of the reason why is because Shabbatian movement, you can imagine, I always imagine Shabbatian movement as coming like a wave. There's this huge Shabbatian wave that comes in like the tide, all this beautiful soil left behind, but the water's gone. Shabbatai is the water coming in, bringing in beautiful silt that will help to grow the new things, and what's left behind is the black earth to grow new things. So in many ways, scholarship in a previous generation argued that Kabbalah made Shabbatai possible. I don't think that's true. I think that actually Shabbatai made Kabbalah possible. And I think that relationship is why Kabbalah is going to survive. Because the Kabbalah is so much more sophisticated, is so much more rich than Shabbatai Tzvi and the Frankists, who only aside from Nathan of Gaza, they developed the most thin, superficial, self-serving, apocalyptic version of Kabbalah that was engineered basically to deify them. And at the end of the day, the Kabbalah they wrote in on was a pretty crap Kabbalah. With the exception of Nathan Nogam, who I think was very profoundly thought. I will give that to Nathan Nogam. Shabtai himself, Frank, they were never deep Kabbalists. They were really, actually, I think, about the Kabbalist life. I think at the end of the day, they were about themselves. And their actions proved it. And the Kabbalah stands on its own. It didn't need them. It existed before them. It was deeper and richer than they could have possibly imagined. And thank God, in many ways, it survived them and it thrived. So tonight we talk about the Kabbalah in the aftermath of Shabbatai. And what I want to really drive home about this is I don't post Shabbatian Kabbalah, because to me and the Frankist movement and all that stuff that we've been talking about, that's an aberration. And it was sort of like a night where everyone, it was like a bender. You know, everyone wanted a bender. They went to New Orleans. They got trashed. They did all the things. They went back to their home, and they shook off the bender. It's not Shabbatian movement. It's kind of a big bender. Went to New Orleans. They went down there, got trashed, did coke, and they did all the things. And when they came back home, they straightened up, and it's over. Shabbatian movement is kind of bender in the history of Judaism. So what happens in the immediate aftermath of 1666 when Shabbatai converts? Well, obviously, the first thing that we've already talked about, there are people who are diehard believers who do everything they can to themselves, using every tool they have in Kabbalah and Torah to convince themselves that Shabbatai is the Messiah, no matter what. No matter if you apostatize, no matter if the movement splits in three groups, no matter if they all have to work in Catholicism, there's always someone out there willing to do the work of trying to convince everyone that this is true. And there are diehards in every religion, there are diehards in almost every, and no matter what happens, they will convince themselves what they want to believe. That's what camp. We spend a lot of time talking about them. They're going to be out there to the 1880s, probably. Also, in the immediate aftermath, 1666, there were a lot of people who realized that this was a catastrophe. There were people who believed in Shabbat. In 1666, when he apostatized, they realized, oh man, this is bad. And what's also particularly important about this is that the people who, at the very beginning of this, who realized this was a disaster, people like Menashe ben Israel, the people who knew this was going to get crazy, never did the talk about it. From in history of Judaism, there's never a major "I told you so" moment. When people gloat and people say "I told you so," and you can go jump in a river, you believe in this guy, and now you're barking back in the tree. You're barking back in my tree, trying to get back to synagogue. Happy to pray to this idiot. Now he's abandoned you, and now what? You can go somewhere else. Go be Christian. What's incredible is the Jews and the rabbis who've seen people make this mistake. Well, and to my knowledge, I don't see the total sub them. They just didn't do that. They were unanimous. And they began to do the work. And what was the work? The work was, let's pretend this never happened. Right? So what did they do? The second camp, the people that realized it was a disaster, back to doing what they were doing before Shabbatai. They went back to the intellectual labor of trying to make Kabbalah work. That is to say, systematizing it. Trying to figure out how the Lurianic Kabbalah lines up with whatever Kabbalah. They went back to the heavy thing of trying to do Kabbalah in a pretty systematic and careful way. Now, that's not the story complete. They realized that something inside Lurianic Kabbalah, something inside of the Kabbalist impulse was dangerous. Because it had gone off the rails. It had gone off the rails, crazy off the rails. And so they began to think about how to implement safeguards to prevent this from happening again. This could have led to real serious problems. Can you imagine what happened if all those Jews had got on those boats and began to sail into the Mediterranean to reach Palestine? It could have been terrifying. 10 Jews could have died. They could have been denied entry into the Ottoman Empire. And who knows what would happen? They can sell back to Spain. You're going to arrive as refugees. This could have been much, much, much worse than it was. And in fact, it's actually very lucky that it's only as bad as it was. So the rabbis began very carefully beginning the business of putting bumpers, basically, on the Kabbalah to prevent it from going off the rails again. And what do those bumpers look like? The main thing is, public Kabbalistic teachings, especially advanced Kabbalah, just stop. You just stop. You just cannot teach me quantum mechanics if they don't understand it to an extent. You just can't. You cannot teach people how to weld if they've never held a hammer before. You have to. You cannot deliver these incredibly complex Kabbalistic ideas, which are incredibly easy to misinterpret, to a population of people basically just don't even have a Torah knowledge. Especially people who've been living in Christian lands who've only recently converted back to Judaism. So they cease teaching Kabbalah publicly. They cease teaching it publicly. Now I know that makes many of us grit. That makes many of us think, oh, these elitists, how dare they hide? Well, you got to put yourself in their shoes. These people were playing, it's like toddlers playing with fire. These people were not prepared to deal with this, and they were able to be convinced of something big because they hurl these crazy Kabbalistic ideas were able to basically fix it. So what ends up happening is that the first thing is that Kabbalah begins to withdraw, especially to a creeping kind of legalism begins to creep in. And that legalism takes the form of safeguards. You need to vet who can learn this stuff. And how do you vet? You vet them based on all kinds of other factors of stability. Those things look like that they're old enough. You don't teach a 13-year-old Kabbalah. You just should, according to the site. How old? Maybe 40. That was the number they said. I bet folks have heard that number before. Well, do you want to teach Kabbalah to a bachelor? No, because a bachelor might get so crazily Kabbalistic, they're just married to God, and they don't want to actually get married to a woman, or what's right, from a traditional perspective. So they need to be married. They need to have a job. They need to have kids. They need something anchoring them to this world. I've actually heard somewhere that Air Force pilots have to be married with kids or something like that, because they don't want them getting in like $50 million, $30 million plane flying around. The idea is that you need to be anchored in this world. You can go to the other world. You can go to the Kabbalistic and so you can go to the Sefirot, fine. But you need something anchoring you to this world. You need a job, you need kids and a wife, you need a family. You cannot just be Kabbalah. That's not healthy. So they think about implement things at the community level that ensure that people who are ill, people who aren't drunks, people who are other kinds, they have all kinds of things that are anchored in the world. Now again, does that sound elitist to you? Maybe it does sound elitist. But is it reasonable? Is it reasonable in just what happened with Chapter 3? It's very reasonable. I think it's very eminently reasonable. So again, I think it's not a bizarre idea. Third, there is a shift away in Kabbalah, away from speculation. That cosmological stuff has led to how the world got created, how Messiah became implanted in the world, as we talked about last time, with the 9 dragons, and messianic speculation just is pretty home. That's over. We're just not going to be messianic speculation. By the way, that's a return to Talmud. Talmud is very clear. The Talmud says, do not speculate about the beginning, do not speculate about the end. Speculate about now. Right? Speculate about now. Don't deal with Masa Bereshit, and do not deal with the end of the world. Deal with now. That's a return to very Orthodox Judaism. And we're going to see that when we get to Chassidism in a minute, the epitome of mystification, the mysticism of the now. Chassidism says, the now. What is in front of your face? The literal thing, the world we're living, more mystically important than what happened back then, what's going to happen later. And so Chassidism is going to pioneer the mysticism of the now. So they really take this into great height as part of an enormous genius of Chassidism. So there's a shift. And what does this shift look like? It's away from what's going on out here. Right? Because trying to figure out what's going on out here, that was dangerous. So what's the shift? The shift is into here. The shift is here. Right? The shift is into the mind and the heart. It's about personal piety. And so it's all about fixing you. We're not focusing our attention on trying to become Messiah anymore. That was a disaster. We're done with that. What we do now now focus our attention on our inner piety. And so the shift in the Kabbalistic language is now toward inner tikkun, not messianic saving the world stuff. It's about saving you and your community, and that's when intense piety comes in. Form of these things we'll talk about in a minute. This idea of kavanot, intense spiritual concentration, and following Jewish law. Remember, part of what people were very upset about with chapter XP, the Shabbatian rejection of Jewish law. And so what ends up happening is that Jewish law becomes then center, just like it was early on. Remember, the Zohar is highly legal. The Zohar never said you couldn't commit the law. In fact, Zohar is very clear with the law that Kabbalah without the Jewish law, without Kabbalah, without Halakha, is incoherent. And so, in many ways, the post-Shabbatian movement is a return to Kabbalah and truth. It's exactly divorcing Kabbalah from Halakha. In the mind of Kabbalah, I tend to agree. And so, this is the old Kabbalah. So, in the end of the day, Kabbalah will leave. Thank God. It deserves to leave. It should not have been. And thank God it wasn't thrown out. The baby with the bathwater. Very glad. But we have to admit that I think the kind of safeguard put on Kabbalah in the aftermath of all this is reasonable. What's also important about this is this story sometimes gets told from a super Eurocentric perspective. Eurocentrism, here it is. The truth of the matter also is that Kabbalistic centers are also appearing all over the Jewish world. In many places in which Shabbatianism really never took a big hold. And those places are going to be places like Yemen, although Shabbatianism was very popular in Yemen and Morocco, Kurdistan, northern Iraq, and Baghdad, also in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you'll remember, was a whole Jerusalem redemption from the very beginning. So these centers in the Arab, not of the European world, are going to be the first to come back online, and they're going to begin producing an enormous amount of Kabbalistic literature. That is that a lot of the literature has been lost, especially as Jews-led Arab lands were expelled from Arab countries. A lot of that literature has been lost, and most of it, to my knowledge, remains manuscript. When I say manuscript, I mean handwritten books from the 16th century. So there's not even printed editions of these books. But we know, and I know this because of other scholars who sort of surveyed literature, there is a mountain of Kabbalistic literature out there, heavily working on monetizing learning in Kabbalah at this time. One of the real interesting personalities of this is Barzani. Akba Barzani is probably the first woman rabbi that we know of, the one who actually really held that title. And she was a Kabbalist, and she seems to have had supernatural powers in Kurdistan, in what is now northern Iran. And her father was very charismatic in place. He was such a pasha. And the only person that thought was his daughter. And so by default, his daughter took his place. And Barzani becomes basically, I think, the world's first real female rabbi. And she's an active Kabbalist. And there's a great children's book about her, too, by the way. I don't know if folks have seen the children's book about recently. There's a children's book about her. I can look at it. But it's really neat. She's just a really incredible character. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in philosophy and religion. One of the most difficult aspects when starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing of all. Of course, neither of these positions are tenable notions that greatly through the ages and there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study, reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to accentuate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are, admittedly, as they are, obscure. My gratitude to Congregation Sophia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. You can find the entire reading under the playlist during the Dark Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be over the next few weeks, or you can find the episodes after autumn of 2021. The entire series, you can find the playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content as esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of freaking scholarly topics in occultism and hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate the consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. All right, everybody. I really can't believe I'm saying this, but after third session, we are now on session 14 of this what was supposed to be a 9 series, Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. And of course, 14 sessions is still too few. I could basically keep teaching this class one day a week for the rest of my life and still not exhaust all the things there are to say about Kabbalah. And I'll be very honest, this last session is going to in some ways be the thinnest because this is where my head out, and I'll be very frank about that. It's just honestly the case. My expertise, I hit a wall, and my wall really is really with Hasidism. I don't know really as much about Hasidism as I probably should. Still learning about Hasidism, and everything from roughly the 18th to the 21st century is where my gap is. Everyone has gaps in their knowledge. It's important to acknowledge the gap, not to pretend to know things we don't. And it's definitely from Hasidism where that gap in my knowledge. Not that I don't know anything, but there are certainly people out there who know a lot more than I do. In fact, I just invited a good friend of mine to do some talks at Congregation Sophia about Hasidism. I really do feel like I gave it short shrift. Deserved a lot more attention, a lot more deep attention than I gave it. So I reached out to a good friend of mine who knows a lot about Hasidism to maybe do a lunch on there. So we'll see if that works out. But at any rate, welcome to the welcome. I would say welcome to the end. It's not the end. It's welcome to the ellipsis, the dot. Kabbalah is not going to go away anytime soon. Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah is doing actually a lot better now. Early part of the 21st century. In the middle of the 20th century, Kabbalah in some ways is at death's door, and it's doing much better now. So in a substantial way, I'm not saying goodbye to Hasidism or goodbye to Kabbalah. Rather, we're saying it's going to continue to grow and change. And I've heard really cool, exciting things about development where we're in sort of new and dynamic Kabbalistic thought. And if we do end up with Israel Palestine in the first 2 months next year, I'm looking forward to kind of getting this on with the Kabbalistic world there in Jerusalem. Well, as we marked last time, these sort of post-Shabbatai world is, I would say that it's actually more sophisticated in the Shabbatai was marked by a relatively thin understanding of the law, really. And that's part of why the Taitzvi was so successful, is that people really didn't understand what was going on first in Kabbalah. And when you read something of a very technical nature, you can be overwhelmed by it, by things that simply aren't true or deep. They can sound deep, but in fact they're not. And I think it's true of a lot of things that went on in Shabbat. It sounded Kabbalistic, had a Kabbalistic veneer, was even a bit. You realize that the reasoning that justified what on with Speed and Frank was, I think, pretty facile. And I think that once people realized, oh, this is just, gold building, they abandoned it pretty quickly. So the years after Shabbatai Speed, after the whole business, what you get is a kind of conservative backlash in the world of Kabbalah, and that shouldn't be Shabbatai business. It's a complete disaster. And so what ends up happening is it's kind of a closing of the ranks. That is to say, after the people doing is returning to the period, return to the Kabbalah much like it was in the period before Shabbatai, where things were a bit more guarded, which I think is probably not always for the worst. And so the developments within Kabbalah, in fact, the developments that now since then have been relatively conservative. Which is to say, we don't see major development in Kabbalah. There's never really been a significant Kabbalah. It's one commentary, footnotes. So that relatively conservative movement marks Kabbalah from about the mid-17th century all the way until now. And as we talked about last time, two major Kabbalistic schools in the aftermath of everything. One of those is Jerusalem, led by Rabbi and Brody in Poland, and those two will become the central schools, so to speak, of Kabbalah, the big school, in the period after. But of course, it's worth pointing out that Kabbalah also developed very highly technical Kabbalah in Baghdad, Pakistan, in Morocco, and Marrakesh, center. So Kabbalah continued to develop in the aftermath of the Shabbatai business, especially the Sephardic niche. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the Sephardi world was much more stable than the Ashkenazi world at that time in terms of social stability, Jewish education. Again, I think I mentioned this several times ago, that a lot of the people that were seduced by the Shabbat movement were people who had only recently really come back to Judaism. And so they don't really anchor in Judaism in a very profound way, in a way that French communities in Baghdad, they've been there for 1,000 years. Easily 1,000 years. And so when I looked at the whole Shabbat, so because they had a much, so the Sephardi world was a bit less affected by the whole thing. And so in Jerusalem, never in the whole Shabbat business, I think it's extricated as soon as they could, that one of the largest Kabbalistic schools in the aftermath of all of it developed. As I mentioned last time, the two schools take very different directions. The school of Islam is going to take the form of really intense inner Kabbalah prayer, and that school again will last basically until 1969, when the last school, which is amazing how long the school lasted for hundreds, although very tightly guarded, very typal student oriented. And the other is a Klois, and that is going to be influenced by Polish and Lithuanian Kabbalah and Jewry. And Polish Lithuanian Kabbalah is going to be mostly remarked by its intense intellectual Kabbalistic speculation. And so out of that world is going to flow a mountain of highly intellectualized Kabbalistic systems that are going to make the work of systematizing Lurianic Kabbalah, especially vis-a-vis the old Cordovera family type of this period also saw, as I talked about last time, the rise of Hasidism. Hasidism is important. Probably it's the most important movement in Judaism probably in the past 300 years. And Hasidism went on to spawn an entirely new system of Judaism, a new system of social relations, dress, all kinds of things have come out of the Hasidic song, the Nigodim that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, out Hasidic world. And so it's on extreme piety, but also piety is meant to find the divine in the everyday. It's a piety in which God is lurking all about you, but you can't see God. The divine is everywhere. I think the line of Quran, which I can easily imagine having written, the Quran said Allah is particularly judgment. That image in the Quran is always documented. And I can easily imagine someone like Ahmad Breslov written something just like that. So the idea that the divine is that close. Obstacle is just you and your ego, or fundamentally you and your desires. It's your desire to get rich, to have fame, or to be loved by someone, whatever things that get in the way of your relationship to the divine. Because the divine is the Hasidic movement is right there. You just have to do the work of the tool of erasing the barriers, and it's in the erasure of the one experience of divine in the everyday, even if the one's physical body, sound of a bird. Some of the Rebbe's were even able to understand the language of the birds. They would see the birds sing. They said they're singing, they're talking, they're having theological, that the Rebbe's could understand the ViralRabbi, and that ViralRabbi allowed them to hear the debates and the birds. I always found like sitting in the forest, listening to the birds, rather than hearing like the rest of us, normie people that the Rebbe's, they don't hear birds, they hear the debates about the birds of God. And so I always found that to be a very cool example of Chassid, where it's not just, you're not just hearing bird sounds, you're hearing theological among the animals. Of course, the Hasidic idea is the deep desire to experience the divine and to cleave to God. The Vegas is clinging to God, and the way that you do this at some level by cultivating a relationship with kind of shamanic character in the Hasidic world. This is the Rebbe, sometimes they're tzaddikim, they're these righteous people who have a unique relationship with God. They're holy, and of course these Rebbe's set up various courts, and those courts operate a bit like royalty, still do operate a bit like royalty even to this day. And so you have a loyalty to the Rebbe, to your Rebbe, and the Chassid encounters the divine primarily through the Rebbe, in that Rebbe Chassid relationship. That Chassidism really grows up. Like spirituality. Today, we'll talk a little bit about how that's gotten a little stranger, especially with the Bible Babbage, but I wish I forgot to mention much. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well, but we'll see how that develops. So, as we talked last time was that what I think that no one really realized in the aftermath of the whole Shabbatai Tzvi thing, that as much as the Shabbatai Tzvi business was a disaster, happening in the background, that was a bigger deal. The same year that Shabbatai Tzvi converted to Islam and apostatized in 66, and I'm sure as many folks in the room know, 66 is a dynamite year in the history. It's the year that Isaac Newton discovered invented calculus, discovered invented bitter debate about that Newton discovered the fundamental nature of light, and also he basically figured out Newtonian physics as we know it now. He published all that in 1666. It's called the year. So at the same time that Newton was figuring all that out, inventing calculus and all this stuff, sometimes being converts to Islam. So it's difficult. I know that for many people, and for me too, when I think about Shabbatai's conversion, I think of it as a big thing. It's something that happened a long time ago. And I think of somehow Newton, a long time ago. Newton feels like I could just sort of, we can play chess and something together. Star Trek. At the same time, they happened the exact same year. And so what's coming down the pipe, and what I think the Jewish world did not see out of this entire Shabbatai business, was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment all around the Jewish world, in France, in North America, in England, and Holland, and Germany, the Enlightenment was developing a huge, completely new worldview that was dynamically breaking from what had come before. with this emphasis on reality, emphasis on science, emphasis on and so we're going to get philosophers like Descartes, like Spinoza. Spinoza's philosophy rejects there's a God separate from nature. It's just nature. And nature is God and God is nature. It's the same thing. We're getting the mechanistic philosophers, the philosophers that believe that all of nature is like a giant machine. Carefully, you can understand how it works. And if you understand how it works, you can predict it, and therefore you can make it do things for you. This incredibly mechanistic philosophy, which is in many ways really wonderful and quite bad. Inside the Jewish world, they never saw this coming. It just sort of landed on their doorstep. When I say landed on their doorstep, I mean what I really mean is Napoleon showed up. What Hegel called the world spirit on horseback. Napoleon shows up in Central Europe and even used to way to Russia. So everywhere Napoleon went, recall, he brought with ideas. His army was a sort of enlightened army. Much as ever enlightened. And Napoleon brought with him the metric system. He brought with him French ideas. He brought with him the idea that if you're a country, you should have equal protection of the law. There should never be second-class citizens. Either you're a citoyen or you're not. And if you are a citoyen, you have the rights and privileges of everyone else that is the rational law. Now, of course, I'm not saying Napoleon was perfect or anything like that, but he was Hegel thought at some level he represented the very movement of Geist, the very movement of God in the realization of godness. And of course, Hegel got disappointed with him later, but made a big Hegel. And so this is at the same time that the Hasidic movement was taking off. And so when these two movements come into contact each other, there's going to be a break-off in the Jewish world where some Jews are going to become very attracted to Enlightenment values, and they're going to incorporate those Enlightenment values into the Jewish world. And that is called the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. And I think for almost everyone here in this class, and almost everyone, all of us are pretty enticed. So by Enlightenment ideas. The idea of equal protection of the law, you can't be just killed because of what you believe in. That we have a rational system of weights and measures that we do in this country, but in many countries in the world. That the scientific, the very fact that this machine is proof of the success of the Enlightenment. So for many Jews, the Enlightenment was the solution to so many problems in the world, both in terms of the inner battles of the Jewish world, what they thought to be a superstitious world ruled by elite dynastic rulers who divine the will of God. And who knows how we figure these things out? And they believe in werewolves, and all this stuff, Kabbalah. Many Jews were very disenfranchised with that and wanted to rush into the world of the Enlightenment. And they did. Jewish folks here. I imagine for many of the Jewish folks in this class, one of the children, great-grandchildren of the masculine, of the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was very, very successful, for better and for worse. So what ends up happening is that this new kind of rational Judaism, integration of Enlightenment with Judaism became incredibly polarizing. Also, for the Jewish folks in the room, we live in an incredibly easy world compared to our ancestors, because in many ways we can adapt both worlds. We can be religious, and we can be in the light somehow. Well, that is distinct. There was no middle ground in the 18th century. Either you join the Enlightenment camp, or you stay on the shtetl and you stay in the world of the pre-Enlightenment, or the traditional world, I suppose one could say. And so in the traditional world, how much of a threat this was. They were terrified of this, and they doubled down on the traditional aspects of the world. And so in many ways, in Judaism and Haredi Judaism, let's say the black hat, Orthodox Judaism that we now are both actually creations of the Enlightenment. Sometimes Haredi folks like to pretend as if they're the legitimate continuers of a discrete continuous line of Judaism reaching all the way back to Moses. Moses wore a black hat, but I guarantee you he didn't. The reality of modern Judaism at some level, all of it is a response to the Hamas. Either you double down on tradition and get into the world of the dynastic world of the Jewish world, or you drifted off into the secular world. You try to make it go at either becoming assimilated, or you try to balance out both. Assimilation was the earliest movement. So what we have here basically is a tremendous level assimilation, right? As much as they allow you to assimilate, whether it's the French, the Germans, and as we'll actually go from the terrifying history of how this will go, assimilation ultimately was a failed strategy to not protect Jews in the end. And neither should God, by the way, wasn't like already people were protected when the first pandemic. And so have is a dualistic applied world by the 1700s in which there are Haskalah Jews, and then there are traditional Jews, and the world becomes polarized, becomes increasingly polarized. Now, that's not to say that Kabbalah stopped. All the kinds of things that have been stopped with the Crusades or the Chapter event or whatever pogroms was stopped Kabbalah. This whole Enlightenment thing didn't stop it either. And so many of the traditional centers of Judaism in the medieval or early modern world, they continued to produce Kabbalah as if nothing was going on. For them, they may have not even known. And so, especially in the pouring of literature, it's this time period where the folks in the Chabad movement, who I'm sure many folks I talk with, they began very rigorously developing their. So it's worth pointing out that the Chabad movement becomes the intellectual center, in many ways, of the Hasidic movement. They become much more interested in the world of the mind and the world of the intellect, as opposed to just the world of the emotions. And Chabad movement actually becomes a rigorous system of Hasidic philosophy, as opposed to he's happy or whatever. So like Rabbi Rothschild, which most folks have heard of, Nachman Breslov, probably one of the most famous Rebbe, of course, known for his deep spiritual reflections and his existential torment that he experiences. He was a person of great highs and great lows. I guess most of these historical people are kind of manic depressive in this way, and so he had this extreme joy, extreme sorrow, feeling, and ultimately he's going to get brought to the neo-Hasidic movement, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also the Nanach movement, which I imagine if you've ever spent time in Israel, encounter some Nanach guys, which tend to smell as pious as they are. They wear the knit cap with Nanach written on it, the music is danced around. There's really possible fault, something. So those guys are out there and they're a big deal in the neo-Hasidic world. Of course, also at this time, probably one of the most important Jewish philosophers and mystics is also writing. This is a Ram called Moshe Chaim Luzzatto during the modern period. Luzzatto wrote a master. It's something today, and I'm like, God, this guy wrote 50 books. I've probably read one or two of them. He wrote 50-something books. It's an enormously huge output. But the Ramchal is a man for having had a spiritual experience where he had a body, a spiritual teacher, began to reveal him all kinds of spiritual things. He was relatively young when this happened, and you can imagine that in the aftermath of the Shabbatai Tzvi business, no one wanted to hear about anyone talking to the spirits anymore. And so he kind of got kicked out of Italy a little bit. He kind of got expelled from Italy, and then during the period of like a ton of stuff. His famous books are Derech Hashem, so the Way of the Lord. They're probably the most systematic, collection or systematization of Judaism that incorporates both philosophical issues and Kabbalah system. Derech Hashem, you get it in Hebrew and English, you want to study it. It's a fantastic text that really does the work of the sort of philosophy of the day. That won't look updated. book. The other major book is a book on ethics, which is also really great to read and also you can get English too. And these books, both these books have gone to become basic classics in the Orthodox world. There's even study sessions. They study these books over and over and over again all through the year. So Derech Hashem, Sharim are classics of Judaism. They become classics of Judaism, and again, they incorporate Kabbalistic and non-philosophical elements into one text. Plato is probably say he's the most important rabbi. The most important rabbi. And so, very, very important. Also, over in Eastern Europe, continuing to do classical Kabbalah. A lot of what's happening at this point in the linguistics is a lot of texts, which are trying to again systematize them, but also there are a lot of encyclopedic texts. They're just going through and trying to list things, describe what things are. One of the problems that comes along with more technical Kabbalah is that the Hebrew language just isn't actually that philosophy. Technical reasons why this is. German is a far better language for doing philosophy, and Hebrew is a sort of clumsy language when it comes to doing philosophy. And it's also a bit of a clumsy language when it comes to doing Kabbalah, ironically enough. And a lot of the technical terms in Kabbalah are very, very confusing. And a lot of what happens during this time period is the encyclopedizing of Kabbalah. And one of the more famous encyclopedias for the time is love to see translated. I have it downstairs, but I can read it. You know, we have translated in the army. This is Sefer Karnaim. Sefer Karnaim is an encyclopedia. The quote, as you may remember, the shards left over in the process, and those shards that are left over are actually demons. Demons that sort of haunt the Oriental world, and it's an encyclopedia of all the demons. So when you get a system account, the evil detritus left over from the creation of the world here in the 18th, 19th centuries, it's a fabulous Now, as you probably all know this, in the 19th century, the amount of anti-Semitism in Europe doesn't go away. Anti-Semitism has always been there in Europe, Northern European anti-Semitism. Well, the anti-Semitism gets a new added dimension. As you might imagine, as Jews become more and more part of secular society, there's also anti-Semitism that emerges at the level of Jews and secular civil society. Of course, the most famous and infamous example is the Dreyfus affair in the 19th century in France. So, with this uptick in anti-Semitism and the ongoing reality, there's sort of three distinct ideas basically about what to do about it. One idea is the traditional idea: double down on being possible God will protect you. Go in theory for many thousand years, but they're not one reality. So one is double down on being biased, God will protect you. The other theory is that at some level, you just need to get out of Europe. Europe is just a death trap. We've been living in Europe now for 1,000 years, and for 1,000 years, it's just been pogrom, crusade, after blood libel, after witch hunt, after whatever. It's just that the Europeans never left us, and at some level, eventually they're going to kill them. Just start time. Turns out they were right. So what do? You leave Europe. And you leave Europe. And in the mid-19th century, that idea takes the form of secular Zionism. This is where hostile Jews, enlightened Jews, decide as a group that Europe is basically untenable and it's the emergence, of course, of very, very basic Zionism. Things that work nobody care about really early Zionism. Entirely a secular movement at first. In fact, it didn't really get to have much religious backing until the mid-20th century, frankly. And so Zionism was a secular and fullest movement, although not all of it was socialist. Not all of socialist movements recognize it now. And that movement, while it did accept some messianic themes, and it was sort of apocalyptic in its the way they talked about the world, it was informed by Kabbalah. But I think that it will repeat a lot of the language of the early Zionists. You will see a lot of the exile, see a lot of language that is coming in from the Kabbalah, although I think it's mostly through social posts, right? So, let me make that clear. I'm going to find a point on it. The Zionist movement early on was never influenced by Kabbalah directly, although I think that there is some Kabbalistic ideas reached Judaism, most of it sort of socialized Moses as Jews, and they've been raised on a diet of. So that's one part of it. The other part of it was is that from a religious perspective, it was completely an Avera. The religious world rejected Zionism very early on. And when I say reject Zionism, most of the religious world still rejects Zionism. It still says Zionism is a toxic, harmful to Palestinians, and it is irreligious. It's blasphemous. It's straight up heresy. And so this early, even I think even the reformers in Germany, they were Zionism in two major conferences. So even as far progressive of the Jewish world, Zionism wasn't a place to start, and it remains a popular now. For any world, folks have been watching the soap opera. You'll know, it's just a writer today. Zionist stuff. Shulam's brothers, he refers to the Zionism. He refers to Shulam, the evil people. And so it's something that developed early on in the response to Zionism. So it never became a place. In fact, I would say that in many ways it wasn't until around post we'll talk about in a minute. And it's certainly until I think after the idea war that in a big way you get religious Zionism from the US. So it's relatively minority. Of course, it continues to develop, right? It's not like the Kabbalah stops. Slide. I mistake in the slide, but I want to talk about this a month ago. But here's the last thing I want to talk about here is that in the 19th century, what also happened in non-Jewish world is there's sometimes what is referred to as the occult revival. The occult revival was a re-interest in occult sciences, alchemy, and sort of a romantic interest in this stuff. And what you get are people like Sibley and Barrett, who are people. You have a bunch of people in the occult camp, and this sort of occult revival that occurred in the 19th century also incorporates some older elements of Christian Kabbalah, and they ultimately develop a new form of Kabbalah out of that gets referred to as the Kabbalah. And this is a completely non-Jewish, occult-centered version of Kabbalah, primarily used for engaging in ceremonial magic. So we have elements of Freemasonry being combined with elements of Renaissance magic, and then that being fused together with elements of Kabbalah, and that develops what we now refer to as the Hermetic. There's Jewish Kabbalah with a K, there is Christian Kabbalah with a C, and now this develops eventually in the 19th century, 20th century, Hermetic Kabbalah used. And these forms of Kabbalah continue into occult practice all the way to this day. So again, in the 19th century, Kabbalah undergoes another mutation, although not a Jewish mutation, but primarily in the Jewish world, primarily in where this occult revival takes place. So the Hermetic Kabbalah is out there, and there's a whole big world of people, spirituality wrapped up with the very sophisticated, very complicated system of So as I mentioned, right, just a minute ago, one of the things that, one of the strategies, right, so we have one strategy doubles down the traditional, Palestine or whatever. The other strategy that I mentioned and we go to is assimilation, which was a very, very good strategy. Perhaps I think one of the more difficult, but many of job of assimilating, I think it was trader. I think it's really unfortunate the way we talk about folks. But it's a really difficult task of trying to maintain two things. It was trying to maintain, also trying to maintain your identity in a world that rejected you. Trying to be Jewish, whatever German Jew was, that Orthodox world hated Jews because they thought that they could sell out. And the Germans never really said they tried. And you can do anything. But I think of people like Husserl. Husserl was a great German philosopher whose son fought in World War I and still got fired when it was over. He just never could enough. Even for the anti-Semites, for the Nazis, the more the Jews assimilated, the more dangerous they were. They were almost hiding among them. And so there was something about this relationship always going to be in some level of losing game. What ends up happening is in the academic world, or the religious world rather I should say, that Jews early on had to make it look like Lutheranism. They had to make a Judaism that looked as much like the Lutheranism of the 19th, 20th century. And that movement is one of these. And if you look at the Lutheran movement and the Reform movement, it's amazing how similar they are. Even the choir, it's just like the organ and stuff, right? If you've ever been to a classical reform, the organs, they even moved Shabbat Sunday morning, all kinds of stuff. They were desperately trying them. And again, one way of looking at it is they're trying to sell out, but again, they did more than you walk a mile in their shoes and understand how devastating the reality of Semitism at that time and how important it would get. At the same time, I admire them. I urge you to try to figure out a way of being German and Jewish, being French and Jewish in a world that you're basically rejected by both sides. Very heroic, a very difficult path to march. On the academic front, what had to happen to justify the viability of Judaism is to justify it to the world of the theologians largely of Lutheran in the mid-19th century, which as you probably imagine, as you may know, even German scholarship at this time was scholarship in the world when it comes to the Bible. This is a time period where critical source theory was being developed. This is a time where the Bible is being systematically studied, scientifically studied for the first time. This is where Hebrew is really getting into the manuscripts of these things. It's really a enormous. In fact, I would say the German biblical scholarship of 10 years probably produced more erudite scholarship than 30 years of what we do. It's amazing. They use 15 languages. They just did. That's just how they work. Had the whole Bible. They just had chunks of the Hebrew Bible. So the scholarship was very pietist, very careful scholarship. And so what's emerging at the same time is the attitude to do the same thing in Judaism. And the attitude to do the same thing in Judaism was largely spearheaded by a group of scholars. This movement became known as the Wissenschaft. And Roz, I beg your mispronounce my German stuff as I go. So the Wissenschaft movement, scientific study of Jewish was in the academic Jewish world, studied Jewish literature using at that time of German scholarship studies of Judaism. And they had to make a decision about what they studied, because what they studied and what they published basically from the outside. So, study what they published, well, Talmud. They focused their elements, they focused their energy on the Talmud. Why? Because the Talmud is a highly systematic, argumentative book based on logic. They can argue that Judaism, because the Talmud is a book of arguments driven by logic, and therefore Judaism is logical. Right? So we have the ethicists in the Hebrew Bible, we have proponents of the Talmud, and therefore Judaism is respectable God of logic. Guess what isn't here? Kabbalah. So, what did they do? Why? Because it was It was superstition, it was occultism, nonsense, made up, fraudulent stuff. For them, what the Visinchak do Kabbalah was embarrassment, put back darkness, because it made Jews look crazy. If you've been listening to some of the stuff I've been saying over the past 14 weeks, you think, God, that sounds nuts. Well, it does sound nuts. And King of Gilgamesh presenting a bunch of erudite Lutheran scholars being like, yes, Judaism. We believe that God masturbated in reality. What? That's not going to fly. Right? It's going to make you. It's going to reinforce every negative stereotype about the Jews. The Jews are irrational. They're driven by nonsense. The Visinchak didn't had to make a decision. And the decision was not Kabbalah. Talmud. And so early on, literature was largely put on the back burner, put it politely. And as you might know, at the same time, this is also the same time that all of the movements were being reformed. The movement, the conservative movement, the argument, the Reconstructionist movement began in the early 20s. All of the movements, and the non-traditional Jewish world, all of them look at the level on the Judaism being pumped out by places like GPS, by places like German places like and guess what? None of those places are doing. None of them are doing Kabbalah. Why? Because they do crazy. The Kabbalah is totally sidelined for 2.5, 3 generations by scholars. The sideline in a decisive Jewish history. What is that decisive moment? The moment the emergence of the movements. So if you grew up in a movement, the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, if you grew up in the movement, their scholars were simply not being trained on Kabbalah. And because they weren't doing shit, they didn't teach it, it was abandoned. The reason why, for folks who grew up, especially for folks who are a bit older than me, if you grew up in the Judaism world, you've never heard about Kabbalah. There's a reason why. Because the rabbis you had learned about it. And that's because the generation before them never learned about it, and the generation they decision not to learn about it. And that's what happens. But effectively, Kabbalah becomes decanonized by the modern Jews. Basically, decanonized. The Zohar, Sefer Yetzirah, all the literature on this basically back on the shelf. And what goes on, what comes back, Talmud, if you're lucky, but most of the time, that's the reason why you will never really see studies of Kabbalah, Talmud, even Talmud. I mean, for folks who keep the movement world, how often did you all study Talmud? How often was Talmud something that you would be encouraged to study or heard about much? Heads to, yeah. Even Talmud, right? Even Talmud. You can imagine Talmud online is true. So that's one part of the story. A huge part of the story is that Kabbalah way, they still did Kabbalah, study Kabbalah. It was decanonized. It's only now limping back into it. Recanonized more books than that. No way to avoid the elephant in the room. What's the Holocaust? The Holocaust devastated single Jewry, but in terms of Kabbalah, it really devastated the Hasidic world. And the reason why it devastated, as you might imagine, is the Hasidic Jews live basically in these social, various types of social networks. They are distinct. They look very Jewish. They dress like Jews. Targeting them was the easiest thing in the world. They all live in the same ghettos. So liquidating them and killing them very, very easy for the Nazis. So these Hasidic world was being destroyed in the Holocaust. I think proportionately, and Roz would be the better expert in this than I would be, that the Hasidic world suffered apocalyptic levels of devastation, and they were sitting ducks. And also their theology was so many of them rejected Zionism, not trying to flee Palestine, and what it was mostly to flee Palestine because they were also tied to their Rebbe. They also didn't want to individually leave, right? They were tied to this. And so if the Rebbe didn't leave, and lasted right, the mark, when the Einsteins removed them, they're living in that. They're living in that shtetl, that Rebbe. And it doesn't take but an act of a really blackout drunk room to do that, to basically eliminate an entire Hasidic dynasty. And Chas v'shalom that happened over and over and over again in Europe, especially with I think 1 in 4 South were killed or something like that. In hospitals, it's just a big story. And actually, the only people keeping the light on at this time, Michelins, for Kabbalah, it's the people in Eastern Europe, it's the traditional people. They're the ones keeping the lights on. And the execution by the beasts that were the Nazis, the light goes out. The light went out. It was a devastating blow to Kabbalah. Now, luckily, our Sephardic brothers and sisters, they were still doing Kabbalah. They were still doing Kabbalah over in Baghdad. They still doing it in Northern Africa. So it wasn't like that the devastating blow that was dealt to European Jews. It is just important to say that the Hasidic movement, the European Jewry, was very important centers of the development in Kabbalah, and the Holocaust were profoundly destroyed. Some continuity. Luckily, they did survive. Many of them survived. And they would regroup. Some of them in America. And in fact, the 2 largest groups, Samar, eventually, Samar eventually made his way out over the war, in the middle of the war, and Rabbi Rothschild also made it out as well. And they refounded their Hasidic dynasty. Real political. So Burl Park and Crown Heights, respectively, go visit the land. It's just right over there in Brooklyn. You folks know this, right? In Israel, the real holy land over there is where I'm going out. So, folks, the rebound. How did this rebound? We have the Holocaust, we have the Haskalah, we have this justice. How did this rebound? It rebounded in a couple different ways. The rebound, in many ways, separates philologists here. Forget that Gerhard Scholem, also people forget that he was Gerhard Scholem. He got Gershomized later, but Gerhard Scholem was a young and avid philologist. He studied language. That's the reason why his scholarship is so top-notch. He reads. And Scholem, the crazy argument that Kabbalah to be academically studied. It just deserves academic. It's part of Jewish history. We need to study it. And so in the 1920s, Gerhard did the heavy lifting of reading basically every single Kabbalist book he gets his hands on in the archives. Every single book. Being the good German scholar that he was, he did that. And unlike the Wissenschaft student who was really important to Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, Gerhard Scholem, argue convincingly that there simply wasn't a Kabbalah. You couldn't do it. You couldn't imagine Judaism without it. Judaism was important, or Kabbalah was as important in history of Judaism as Talmud, as anything else. So, Scholem argued over that Kabbalah had to be reintegrated both academically and historically into the history and thinking about Judaism. And this was easy, folks. And when Scholem, who was already an established scholar at the time, was invited to JTS, he was a lecturer at JTS Theological Seminary there in New York. When he was allowed to speak, the education for him to speak was that, look, the Kabbalah is nonsense. Kabbalah is nourishment. Kabbalah is not nonsense. But Narishkeit is Narish. Aber Shifted is Narishkeit, das is Bishah. Right? Nonsense is nonsense. The history of nonsense is science. Kabbalah is nonsense. But the history of Kabbalah is science. It's worth studying as historian, but God forbid anyone repeal it. That's ridiculous. That, by the way, was coming from this secular, or the most famous progressive Talmud scholar in 20th century history, Saul Lieberman, probably the most important Talmud scholars of the early 20th century, the professor JTS. They invented modern sort of secular Talmud against Saul Lieberman. That's how Sholem is. Can you imagine being introduced at JTS by basically saying, yeah, what you study is nonsense. But because you study his history, that's something that we used to do, completely crazy. So Sholem really had to walk an uphill battle. He fought an uphill battle the entire time to get legitimacy for what he's imaginable now, considering that Kabbalah is so legitimate, so mainstream. But Sholem had to fight that battle in many ways on his own. Luckily, he was a very capable scholar. Sholem brought him an army of students. He attracted a great deal of students from Moshe Dell and other folks who's grown up become themselves leading scholars in the world of Kabbalah. His students were also willing to criticize him, and did. They made careers criticizing him. Folks like Moshe Dell really showed how important Sholem was, and also how influential Sholem was. A whole generation of scholars Weiss, all kinds of stuff running around. It's a huge group of scholars that blow my mind with every book that they write. And so the academic study of Kabbalah is limited. Totally legit if you want to study Kabbalah. You can take an academic level Kabbalah class, and no one's going to bat an eye. Sure, part of the truth. At the same time, there is an emergence of a small group of religious scientists, and he would eventually give rise to this. Knowing although Rothschild wasn't terribly influenced by, certainly a lot of the Korean themes of exile and redemption will play a part in the Zionism. The most important, I think, Kabbalists that come really in the early mid-20th century was the Rabbi Rothschild, the master of the latter. The Baal Salam would lead in Israel, and he would compose two early influential works. The most important, I think, is his commentary on the Zohar. I think it's 8 years to write, called Hasalam. And this is a book introduction to the Zohar, modern, easy, and accessible to a whole lot of people who otherwise would not be able to read it in the original. And so it's much more accessible to the modern Hebrew. So many people who read are now in Orthodox, and also many people who study Isaac Luria are going to study many of his ideas at some level through the lens of Rabbi Rothschild, who also developed an ultimate, like, interesting concept. I can think of based on some ideals in North Israel is Alps. So you know, I think it's probably the most important. Another character that I don't mention in this that I can't believe left out, of course, is Rabbi Schneerson, of course, was the head of Chabad the Babin movement, and what is important to know about him is that he became one of the most important founders of the Kiruv movement, that is to say, the H movement among Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews. So we were into a Chabad house because he sent someone to them, and Menachem Schneerson founded this Kiruv network of Chabad movement, and he was just a huge history of 20th century Judaism. It's really hard to downplay all the really important things he did. But one of the things worth mentioning here that's important going into 21st century Judaism is that when he died in the 90s, it was already believed in his lifetime that he was the Messiah, and then when he died, people really became his Messiah. It's movement in the world, it's not a super movement. I don't think it's 90s. It seems to be mostly localized to Brooklyn, and where they believe he's the Messiah. Also, I have a long so I have the Catholic believed to be the Messiah, and studied briefly at a Chabad yeshiva, and I definitely met people who believed that he was, but that he had been taken into heaven bodily, and that he returned really soon, and that it really is returned by Jews without more Torah, and that basically he was kind of occluded, and his occultation was, and the Rebbe would, of course, you can still go to Crown Heights, you can still go to Brooklyn, and you can still images of the Rebbe's flag, which would be yellow with crown on the side. So there's this huge messianic movement, which again could be a whole class unto itself. Inside the Chabad they do believe that their late leader is the Messiah. It's causing some serious problems in the Chabad because it's such a movement based on outreach. Although, in my experience, and what I've been told by folks, is that really the kind of people that messianic stuff appeals to are typically people like Paul Shubas, who convert to Orthodox Judaism, and younger people, most of the more established worlds who doesn't science stuff. Although I think they do still control 770 as the main source. So, there's some messianic which is super weird. For the folks who are in Michigan who are hanging out with me, you probably have never heard about this or heard about it only briefly because the Shinto family, which is the larger Chabad family in Michigan, is a very old Chabad family. They were seen here as in a series of the Rebbe way back in the 70s or 80s, something like that. They were the lead ways of the anti-messianism. They were powerful here, at least in Michigan. Don't think Kansas ever got a football in the Metro Detroit area when it comes to that stuff. That's for other places, but I don't think the messianic Kansas is going to have a football. But go to Brooklyn, go to 770. Alright, the last two things I guess I'll mention before we wrap up is the rise of pioneered by Uber came out of the Pacific world a lot of it's not the right word, but wanted to sort of modernize and expand this movement. And so many of the tales of freedom of spirituality and sort of export out of the Pacific world and then exported into the modern and the conservative world especially, and the Reconstructionist world most recently into the Kabbalah of the 1970s. This is a period of callbacks and stuff like that, sort of callback diet. And so it's in that we have the rise of what we call the Hasidic movement, and this movement is extraordinarily popular in the Jewish world, and there are great luminaries in the Hasidic world. Recently passed away, like Rabbi Rothschild, and one of a lot of students at Hebrew College. It's probably one of the premier Hasidic in the world right now. I got to have people together and talk about Kabbalah briefly. I feel it's kind of great honor to be able to hang out with one of the Gaons of Hasidic food. And so I got to spend some time with our Green, Boston, and Milan. So the Neo-Hasidic movement is alive and well, and it's popular. It's growing in popularity. And it's like Joe Weisenberg and really channeling Hasidic ideas into music, but that's continues. The last thing I'll mention is the thing I imagine most already know is pop culture Kabbalah. The Kabbalah Center led by Rabbi Rothschild, which has received a lot of criticism, but whatever, I think that it's a legit form of Kabbalah as much as anything else, at least from an academic perspective. The Kabbalah Center, they have outfits all over the world. It's sort of franchises kind of, and they teach a very specific kind that is tailored toward celebrities, basically. Another of non-celebrities that get into it is a form of sort of new age, traditional Kabbalah. But this has been famous by folks like Madonna, Britney Spears was into it for a while, which Britney Spears has a Hebrew tattoo on the back of her neck, Kabbalistic tattoo. I don't know what sense Kabbalistic tattoos make, but I think she's from the city, so I think we're home state people, so good. So people like Britney Spears and Madonna, so I think we're home
Louisiana.
state in Britain, go back.
Come on. Yeah, I know about.
So people like Britney Spears and Madonna embraced Kabbalah in a way, and apparently I think Madonna was doing concerts on Friday night because of her different kinds of Kabbalistic beliefs. Well, I think that the material goes from here, right? She's from Bay City. Madonna's from Bay City. So it goes from here.
So, she is from Mississippi.
Madonna influenced very
dog.
heavily by Kabbalah, some of what Judaism. People who've been influenced. The Kabbalah Center is very polarized. It's very controversial. We've got some trouble money stuff. A religious organization gets involved with celebrities and gets in trouble with money stuff. Can you believe that? So the Kabbalah, in many ways, is out really more popular. Musicians, other folks becoming really influenced by Kabbalistic ideas. Those ideas are becoming mainstream, right? Very mainstream. Kabbalah is gonna live. Kabbalah is gonna survive us all. It's back. The Kabbalah has gone through a couple thousand years now of messiahs, dead messiahs, apostate messiahs, a mountain of books and commentaries. Gone through, I think, almost every kind of travail a religion can go through, a philosophy can go through. No that I can think of has gone through this much. Communism or communism or whatever. Kabbalah has gone through so much to transform, adapt itself. And when I think about the Kabbalah, I'm very happy and very glad to be alive now. Because we're now living in the golden age of Kabbalistic literature. More available to anyone else when it comes to accessible information. More Kabbalistic teachers are available. Secular Kabbalistic education is available. Completely secular academics on Kabbalah. Also, you can go to dozens of teachers about Kabbalah. And Kabbalah is accessible to people who've never accessible before. Women, LG folks, it's accessible in a way that it never was before. And so, I say that Kabbalah dies. Kabbalah lives, Kabbalah will live, for the family been able to, at some level, withhold the secrets. You have to work hard to learn Hebrew, learn Aramaic, you have to move to Israel, go to Brooklyn. You have to do a lot of heavy lifting if you really want to get into Kabbalah. But you can. It's there. So much of it is. Right? So much of it is via interlibrary alone. You go right there and learn secrets of the Kabbalah that would have been utterly inaccessible to 99% most of you. There they are, immediately available. Even English translations of things like the Zohar, massive 12 volumes. There was no translation of the Zohar. And now, for the first time in history, we have access to all 12 of the Zohar things that we now. So we're living in a golden age. We have Kabbalah, and we're living in a golden age for those who want to be Kabbalists. And I have to say that I'm really happy, and I feel really blessed, and I feel really grateful that all of of you have decided to come along with me on this 14-week journey through the history of Kabbalah, because I feel very lucky that I have the privilege and the honor to learn about Kabbalah and share what little I know, and to know that there are people interested in learning and learn again what little I know. And so I just want to with you who hung out with me over the course of 14 weeks to learn some Kabbalah together and to learn about Kabbalah and learn that this tradition is beautiful and strange and science fiction-y, just all over and wonderful. So I just want to express my deep gratitude for dropped in for a class or stayed for all 14, whatever. I'm just really grateful and really glad. So really thankful for everyone time who's taken the time to learn some Kabbalah with me and opportunity to learn a lot of this class. So that's it. Thank you. Honor and to people to come to that. And I look at all of you are Kabbalah or not. It's like my secret. My secret of the Zohar class. Study Zohar and also study about the Zohar. Now imagine a class that is structured like a science class where you have the lecture in the lab. The lecture would be like this, and then we'd have a lab. The lab would be like this. Imagine that's my dream gig. It's a lecture lab class. Which I can say it's a little more exciting to me than working in a chemistry lab. So folks, that's the up to you all at some point. But I guess again, I was in the same and so I'm happy to folks on this journey. And it doesn't end here. I will definitely say that. Like I said, with the end of Kabbalah, we're ending with ... because Kabbalah is going to outlive us all. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me as I explore the garden of
appreciated. I love the blessing. Yep. Go fuck yourself.